Hello, everyone, and welcome to this video. I'm Leonie White, co-director at the Queensland Institute of Family Therapy, also called QIFT for short, QIFT. And today I'm really excited to be creating this video of a conversation with Sigrid and Louise from Macro Consulting, together with our Auslan interpreter. Now, before we get started with proper introductions, I'd really like to invite Sigrid to say a few words. Sigrid let me know that she really appreciates, as we all do, the importance of acknowledging country. So, Sigrid, would that be okay to ask you to do that?
Hi, I'm Sigrid, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting here and everyone is on different lands around Australia, on different nations. I am on Bundjalung land, and I'd also like to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on where we meet and where we stand today. I'd also like to add a mention about deaf advocacy throughout the generations, advocating for deaf culture and deaf community to continue growing stronger. I'll pass it on to Louise.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm here today on Turrbal and Yagara People's Land.
Thank you, Louise.
Also, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners here.
Thank you. And I'm making this video on the lands of the Yugambeh people. And so I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I am, where I'm living and working and making this video today. But my hope is that the information we're sharing in our conversation is going to go much further than just the lands we are. And so I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners, across the whole country, wherever the people are sitting who are watching this video. I really want to acknowledge the importance of culture and also to follow with the acknowledgement of the elders past, present, and emerging. So welcome to this video. We're going to be exploring some ideas around how to work with people in the deaf community and what we can do as counsellors and helping professionals to understand and to collaborate with this work. So is it okay if we start, Sigrid, with inviting you to introduce yourself and who you are and what you do?
Hi. So I'm Sigrid. This is my sign name. I'm a deaf person. My work background, my work history is community work, but it reaches out into many different areas. I wear many different hats. I'm connected to community and arts and advocacy. Most of my work is focused, though, on how to create connection between the deaf community and mainstream society and connecting them to mainstream services. All of the services and all of the opportunities that are available to the mainstream community, how can I actually create a bridge between the deaf community and those services?
Thank you. And Louise, would it be okay if I asked you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi. My name's Louise Munro, and I've been working as a psychologist for 20 years. Feels like a long time when I say that. And I got interested in working with the deaf community when I had a sign language interpreter ask me about doing some debriefing with sign language interpreters after they'd finished sessions, and some of the work that they'd been interpreting they'd found was, staying with them. And so I got into working with the deaf community and learning about deaf culture via support for some sign language interpreters, and that's nearly 20 years ago. And I got really involved and interested in the whole idea of deafness from a cultural perspective rather than a disability perspective. And I pretty quickly learnt that understanding sign language was going to be really important. So I got myself enrolled in some classes, and yeah, I've kind of been building my practice and learning since then.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm just really excited and really grateful that you guys have agreed to make this video and to have this conversation. Because I know for myself, there's so much that I want to learn about family and community and culture, and just to let the viewers know that we are going to do this as a conversation, that hopefully they can really benefit from learning as well. So that brings me to my next question. So we have Sigrid and we have Louise, but who are you guys together? I'm wondering, Sigrid, could you tell us about macro consulting and how you guys are together?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So from my perspective, when I've worked with many different organizations in with different therapies or community work or service providers, I've noticed that there's a common theme. And it's that people haven't realized a lot of things about the deaf community already. They don't realize how much culture, the barriers that the deaf people experience. So when deaf people are going out into the world and meeting with hearing people out in the world, there's so many things that deaf people need to navigate, and it takes up so much time. And there's so much education that we can offer to hearing people and service providers before we can actually work really well together. So when Louise and I connected, and Louise had such a rich background because of Louise's history of research and working within the deaf community, Louise had that background knowledge of how we need to adjust to be able to connect to the deaf community. So we both have similar goals, that we want to improve the accessibility for deaf people. And we have conversations about the things that we notice in the therapy or mental health arenas, and just things that we've noticed that would really help the professionals in that area. We're both observing that there are gaps in deaf awareness, particularly in the professional areas. And how can we solve those issues? There's not enough professional people available for deaf people to access services. So we can see that there is some training that is required. And so we decided to create this training module. There are 5 modules that we provide to professionals who aim to work with deaf people. So we work together to provide that and to co-present that training. Did you want to add anything more there, Louise?
Yeah, no, that's a good summary of what we do. And while you're talking there, Sigrid, I'm reminded of just how huge this area is and why we have 5 modules and not 1. Because there really is so much that goes into being able to provide what we call a culturally affirmative service. That's one of the terms that we use in our education programs. So again, that's about privileging deafness as a culture rather than a disability. And I think with one thing that has really contributed to our identification of this need is with the use of the NDIS. There's a lot of people out there who now have access to support, but the support is not really culturally affirmative support.
Mm.
So that was one of the biggest needs that we identified.
Mm.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
It makes sense to me that you need 5 modules because culture is rich and complex. And certainly in my experience working with other professionals, I would agree. There's not a lot of knowledge about this culture or about how to work in ways that are affirming and really collaborative.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's the cultural perspective as well. And then also, I'm sure that Louise would agree about the research and the evidence-based practice. Yeah. It's not really targeted at the deaf community.
Mm. And I think that's one of the first surprising things that a lot of therapists discover is that the idea of what is evidence-based practice doesn't really fit, because the research that's gone into what we call evidence hasn't been done with deaf people in the deaf community.
That's such a great point, and certainly something that I bring to your awareness in your university training.
Yeah, yeah. When we're teaching research methods,
Yeah.
we often raise that idea of, who has the evidence been researched for? What is the basis of those research
Mm.
models? Yeah.
So the work that you guys are doing together is so important to make such a big difference, to make all of this information available to other professionals. And then it gets me wondering though, when you guys work together, how do you work together? What's your model for, coming from, I guess if we're saying different cultures, how are you guys working together? Maybe Sigrid, would it be okay to ask you first?
Yeah. So we work under allyship, that model. We choose to work together because we do believe that it is really important to give the perspective of the deaf people themselves, but also combine that with research
Mm-hmm.
and professional practice and professional experience. So it's a really great match to be able to combine those perspectives. So my background is that I have early studies in environmental studies,
Mm-hmm.
environmental science. And I'll just tell you a little bit about how I got here. So I've done a lot of different things in my past. But when I look back to my environmental studies, one of the biggest things that really got me was looking at ecosystems and its impact on the community. So if there's diversity in communities and each individual aspect in the community are supported and their health is important within the community, then ensuring that individual needs are supported actually brings a healthy ecosystem to the community, and it creates more resilience and strength in the community.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very similar thing to human communities. So if we've got diversity within those communities, then that brings more health to each individuals and gives everyone the opportunity to grow and to be stronger and resilient, knowing that they can actually move forward with their own individual lives with health and recognition of their needs. So I feel like that allyship of working together, being good allies towards each other, it helps us to recognize that if the system does not serve each individual person, then we can actually find out who is lacking in support, and we can be an ally to that individual and try to work out how we can resolve that lack of support, just to fix that imbalance, to ensure that there is balance and that we work together. So from both the community's perspective, but also working with that professional perspective as well, just to identify the gaps that are present and also just share knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I learned so much from working with Sigrid. And sometimes I throw research papers at her, which she's got to juggle with all of the other stuff that she does. So we're always kind of sharing
Yeah.
where we've got our strengths,
Yeah.
and that allyship model really fits with the notion of collaborative practice.
Mm.
And we it's one of our philosophical principles, that diversity benefits everyone.
Yeah, I was really struck with that. The way you explained, Sigrid, coming from environmental sciences and understanding healthy environments and then understanding healthy communities. And that really fits with the history of family therapy, because some of the early understandings from family therapy do come from looking at ecological and biological systems. And in family therapy, we really do privilege and appreciate the importance of difference and multiple perspectives. So that really struck me what you were saying. So then for this video, for people who are watching today, I'm just thinking, we would definitely love to put your website details in the written description, so people know where to find you and how to find you and how to find out more. But for today, um, let's talk a little bit more about kind of what's going on, and help people even maybe start to understand, some things that are important about the deaf community and communication and being a service provider for a person who is deaf. And I wondered if we could start with even thinking about terminology. Terminology is really popular in lots of different areas of life at the moment. And so, one of the things I was really curious about is how a deaf person might like to be known and be referred to, and what's kind of a good way to think about that. So, Sigrid, is it okay to ask you again, kind of first about that from your experience?
So in the community, there are two main words. So there's deaf, and then there's hard of hearing.
Okay.
So that's generally accepted, these two. And I always say, just follow the person's preference.
Yeah.
So there are other terminologies that are used, but the top two that you'll see written in many people's preferred use is deaf or hard of hearing. It depends on their childhood. It depends on their cultural background. Yeah. Some people who are born deaf, they're more likely to use the terminology of deaf to refer to themselves.
Mm.
And there are other reasons for why a person would choose deaf. But I would definitely say, yeah, always listen to that person's preference.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And with those two terms, are there any sort of important differences that you'd like professionals to know about or to consider? Are there sort of different subtleties in culture or ways of being?
So deaf, especially if it's used with a capital,
Mm-hmm.
that's a cultural identity
Okay.
marker. So that focuses on the person's identity and that they identify strongly as a deaf person.
Mm-hmm.
Often they use Auslan,
Yeah.
and most of the time, if they have a strong deaf identity, they do utilize Auslan. And other people who are hard of hearing, they might have different levels of hearing.
Mm-hmm.
They could potentially be more hearing and use hearing aids. But really, it's not black and white. Yeah. So there are people with really strong deaf identities, and perhaps they can still, they choose to speak and choose to use both languages and also use hearing aids. And some hard of hearing people will use Auslan as well. So there is no, one way or another way. It really comes down to the person and how they identify with their deaf identity. There's something called deafhood,
Okay.
and that gives the person their own choices of how they identify within the community. The sign for deafhood is this. It's like what's inside of them, how they feel deeply inside.
Mm.
So yeah, definitely giving each deaf person control of how they identify.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. Some people I work with get really kind of nervous or worried about doing the wrong thing or accidentally offending a person. And then they let me know sometimes they shy away from asking questions. And so, for anyone who's watching the video who feels a bit nervous, um, would you have any advice about whether it's okay to just ask a person directly? How do you identify? How do you like to be referred to?
So that's one of the cultural things about deaf people is they're straight talkers. Yeah. So just ask.
Okay.
Yeah, just ask and just say, look, I'm unsure of the correct terminology here. So could you just let me know what you prefer, and I'll follow your lead. And sometimes if you say or you type out the wrong word, if the deaf or hard of hearing person says, hey, I actually prefer to be identified like this, yeah, don't take it personally. We're so used to it. We really do appreciate if you're happy to learn from that experience.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I love that idea of being a straight talker. And I think that's probably really helpful for people to know that I imagine that means if you get feedback from a deaf person, that it doesn't mean necessarily that things are going really wrong or off track. They're just letting you know their perspective, and it's important to stay with them and to keep collaborating.
Yeah. Like all deaf people are not the same, but generally it is so much better to just have the conversations about it rather than sort of, going around it.
Yeah. Louise, I'm conscious that I've been talking a lot with Sigrid at the moment, and I'm wondering if anything's kind of come into your mind, any thoughts that you wanted to share around your experience in this area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing I might add to the discussion about identity is that identities also change over time and in different contexts. So I've known deaf people who have kind of moved into a fully deaf, capital D deaf identity over time. I've known other deaf people who'll describe themselves as hard of hearing when they're in a group where there's largely hearing people or speaking people, and deaf in a group that's, a fully signing group. So And I think that's like all of us, you know, we refer to the identity that helps us most at a particular time.
Mm.
Yeah. But it also reminds me that I was thinking about the numbers of deaf and hard of hearing people in Australia, and so we've got this great sort of, we talk about the audiological spectrum. So it's something like 1 in 6 Australian people have a level of hearing loss that can actually get in the way of understanding hearing conversations.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot. But then at the far end of that spectrum, where you've got people who really identify as deaf, that's a much smaller number, and we generally categorize that group based on having Auslan as their preferred mode of communication, which is more of a defining characteristic than their actual audiological status.
Mm.
And in Australia, the estimates for Auslan users are around 20 to 30,000. I'll check in with Sigrid about that. Is that your understanding? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It's always very difficult to pinpoint precisely the number of Auslan users. Again, that kind of circles around to how the system can be quite difficult to utilize by deaf people, especially if their language, their education, their social needs haven't been met and there have been barriers there. So the ABS is a little bit more difficult. It's harder for them to get accurate information from the deaf community.
Mm. Okay.
And so with those numbers, what we also have then is almost no therapists who are fluent in Auslan. Maybe, I don't
That's
know, 3 or 4 in Australia. Maybe.
that's incredible to think that for such a large portion of our community as a country, we have such a small, ridiculously small amount of support providers.
In first language.
Yes.
And I will just adjust those numbers because I know we're being recorded, so I want to get it right. So probably in Queensland we might have maybe 4 or 5, and I
Mhm.
use the word therapist, so that includes counsellors, social workers,
Yes.
psychologists,
Yeah.
and some of those people aren't deaf, but they have fluency in Auslan.
Hmm.
And it would be roughly the same in each state.
Hmm.
Looking at APRA registered psychologists, we're getting to an even smaller number. And I think in Australia we have maybe 2.
Okay. Wow.
Mm.
So it makes so much sense then that the two of you wanted to work together in this way to put together some information for other therapists to at least start to understand the deaf community, kind of the issues that are faced, even things, Sigrid, that you've touched on about how much more complex things are, how much more kind of involved it is to access information and services. Yeah, I can really see like why this matters.
Yeah.
I think also, as Louise and I work with individuals, often they'll ask us for referral pathways, but we only have very limited numbers of people that we can refer them to.
Mm.
And what we would like to ensure is that we refer them to the correct people with the cultural affirmation
Mm.
background. And we've experienced that there are barriers here.
Mm.
So we've been trying to work out how to break through those barriers and build our options as professionals to be able to refer our community.
Mm.
Because community members need choice. So we
Yes.
want to have choices in age and choices in gender and choices in geographical location. So the more people who are aware of how to work in this culturally affirmative way, the more choice people in the deaf and hard of hearing community have.
So when we talk to other professionals who are in the deaf community, they all say the same thing. We can't serve all the people. There's only a small number of us. There is not enough of us.
Mm.
Okay, guys, so we've just been getting to know a little bit about you and the way that you're working, and starting to get just a really small understanding around being in the deaf community. I wondered if it would be helpful to start to touch on some of the barriers and some of the difficulties and things that people who are working as therapists probably don't even know that they don't know in terms of access to services. Would it be okay, Sigrid, to ask you, like, what are really common ones that come straight to mind that you would love people to know about?
Like what I said earlier, it's very diverse in the deaf community. So there's deaf culture, or there's the hard of hearing culture, and there are so many differences in the in-between. And for everybody, communication will be different. So the barriers that they face in regards to communication, and communication is so important with their services. It's will never be the same experience as it will be for most people in the mainstream. So from the start, just trying to access the services, there's a barrier. And the deaf person has to adjust to try to work out how to communicate with the service provider. So before they even walk in for the appointment, the deaf or hard of hearing person has already put so much energy into just getting there.
Mm.
And this is my lived experience as well as what I've observed within my community. Anyone in the community, professional or not, they don't actually realize that this is a very unseen part of the effort of the deaf person to try to match the hearing world, to connect to the hearing world. So this ends up with many people experiencing fatigue, anxiety, depression, and different mental health impacts just from everyday life, just trying to adjust into a hearing world. So, yeah. So that's just the umbrella of it. But there are so many barriers going back to their childhood and growing up in the hearing community, and just everyday life issues like micro challenges that are constant. And they are building all the time, giving the deaf person their position of where they stand now, of how influenced they are in regards to just the experiences they've had already. And there are so many different outcomes from the influences of those barriers. And it's very normal for anyone with some sort of hearing loss to experience this.
Mm.
I just get the sense that everything takes a lot more work and a lot more patience. And sometimes it must just be incredibly hard to be patient and to have to try to fit into a hearing world when everyone, should have, be able to access services in the same way.
Yeah, yeah. It's so true. Recognizing those impacts. even for a deaf person to actually realize it for themselves is huge. Wow, I am
Yes.
working. I am doing all the work. And so, yeah, sometimes they need to have a bit of a shift in perspective so that they understand why they're so exhausted
Yeah.
and why they're in the position that they're in today. And it's literally because of their lived experience. And in particular to just like the daily life, day-to-day experiences, and realizing how it impacts us as people and how it impacts our interactions with other people.
Yeah. I'm wondering, in terms of people watching this video, so they get a really clear picture in a very practical way of what this looks like. Louise, I know that you work with deaf people and that you know, have previously chatted to me about difficulties accessing services. I wonder, do you kind of have any examples of what this actually looks like when someone is trying to contact you or another therapist?
Mm. Yeah, definitely. I think the background information that is relevant here is that a lot of deaf people in Australia have not had a full education in either Auslan or English, and a lack of access to a full language really limits literacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we realise how much English literacy is required to access a lot of what happens in daily life. Um, so, where you and I, as therapists, Leonie, might have our website, it's often full of pretty dense language.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, recently I put together a new consent form for the work that I do with my clients. And I've also put together an Auslan consent form so that people can access that information in Auslan.
Mm.
Um, so English literacy is an issue. Using the telephone is an issue.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes just the technology is an issue.
Yeah.
So a lot of us learn about how to use Zoom or how to use an iPad because we have great social networks. We're connected. And that's not the case for a lot of deaf people. They don't always have great social networks. They're isolated from family. They might be the only deaf person in their family. And in fact, that's very common.
Yeah.
That lived experience can impact on confidence. And um, a lot of deaf people have told me that they've grown up being assessed. Their first introduction to life is an audiological assessment.
Mm.
And then, you know, depending on the cause of the hearing loss, they might be struggling at preschool, they might be struggling at school. And so there's a lifetime of struggle and assessment.
Mm.
And so those things impact someone's ability to engage in meaningful social life and to access information.
Mm. I wonder if it makes it hard to engage with the therapist too. You know, if those relationships in the past have felt like you're being assessed, maybe you didn't say this word, but maybe for some people feeling judged, um, which often goes with being assessed, is what some of my clients tell me. Gosh, I think it feels like a huge courageous act to contact a therapist to start with.
Yeah, yeah. And they've got so many different experiences that they bring with them that aren't always positive. So not feeling understood. Yeah. So I think in regards to the in therapy, one of the biggest tips is more time. Take that time to work out the barriers. both for the professional and also for the deaf person.
Mm.
To feel like that the relationship can be built first.
Mm.
And I feel like the assessment process doesn't give time for that. So sometimes when you're booked in for the assessment, it's a very limited amount of time taken for that assessment. And so the deaf person receives less service than the hearing client because of the barriers.
Mm.
Yeah. Sorry, I have to pause for a minute because often when you guys say things, it's the first time that I've really thought about it that way myself. And it just, I just kind of get a more heavy sense of what it's like. And then when I think about working as a therapist, it gets me thinking about the importance in slowing down at the start. But also something I would normally do is talk to a person about their past experiences of services and what's been good and what's been not so good, so that I can try to make sure I don't, like repeat the not so good things. And I wonder if that's a really great kind of tip for people, is to really ask and get some straight talk about what has your experience of past services been like, and how can we work together, and how will you let me know if I miss something that I need to be paying attention to?
I'll go back to what you mentioned earlier about just taking that moment to pause, because there's so many new perspectives here to feel into, and that's such a common reaction Louise and I see in the workshops.
Mm.
People kind of getting it, like one question just becomes so many different ways it could go. So that's why I think this type of learning is really important, because if Louise and I share our experiences and our knowledge with other professionals, then it actually takes the burden off of the deaf client in that first meeting with the professional. So the deaf client doesn't have to do that work if the professional has already done the work themselves. So I'll ask Louise here. So sometimes when you meet new deaf clients, do they look surprised when you've already got that deaf awareness?
Yeah, often they're really surprised that I have some signing skills, and they really appreciate that. That is something that seems to form a bit of an instant connection. Oh, you understand sign language, you can sign. And I think probably the most common answer I get when I ask people what their previous experiences have been like, if they've not had a good experience, they will say to me, "Oh, they don't know deaf. I saw a counselor, I saw a psychologist, but they don't know deaf." And yeah, so coming to see someone who they know has some experience and is also prepared to ask them about their own individual experience, because it's important to kind of get that general idea of deafness and also recognize that you have these unique individual experiences as well.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of also that we've talked a lot about deaf with a capital D, but I would just like to add a little bit more about the hard of hearing person's experience. It's a very unique experience onto itself. So I think the main thing really is to be ready to adjust and to meet that person where they are, and to be open to their own individual experiences. It's the same as with any client, but yes, that extra time, having patience, and that extra understanding that, there is a really complex story that is just that little bit different to a hearing client's experience when they come for that first appointment.
Mm.
Yeah, thanks, Sigrid. And I guess that from my perspective, when I reflect on this conversation, I feel like that even highlights, how much more I have to learn, that, I've been not creating as much space to talk about people who are hard of hearing as the questions I've had about the deaf community. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. And I think, again, it just continues to highlight, I've been working for a really long time. But I still have so much to learn in particular areas like this.
Yeah, Louise, in the modules, there are certain modules that cover information about deaf and hard of hearing and the spectrum and the differences of experience between, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, that's
And
fantastic.
if I talked a little bit about the brief content in the 5 modules, that might give you a bit of an
Yeah.
overview, kind of how we introduce this big area.
Mm.
So module 1 really is for people who've never worked with someone who's deaf, or has a hearing loss, or has a cochlear implant, or they've just never really thought of it. And so we start from scratch, and we look at terminology, we look at statistics, and we look at some really kind of quick accommodations that you might be able to make. The next module builds on that. So each module builds a little bit. So then we move on to what it means to identify as hard of hearing. And we talk a little bit more in that module about some of the assistive devices. Some people will use hearing aids, some people will use cochlears, and some people will use interpreters. And there's a range of different benefits that each of those provide. And there's lots of different reasons why people would choose any of those. And then module 3, we start to talk about how to actually communicate with the use of an interpreter, how to use plain English rather than formal English, the importance of captions, the impact of literacy. Sign language is a very visual language, so we talk about how we might actually bring the use of diagrams and images. And I know one of the things that we said we'd talk about, Leonie, was genograms as well. So
Yeah.
we'll do that.
Yeah.
The next module is specifically for counselling and therapeutic helping conversations. So it's not just counselling and psychology, it's people who want to have helping conversations. And we talk a little bit about the different models, we talk about different models of counselling. We talk about what evidence does exist and what doesn't, and how to really bring in the idea of culturally affirmative aspects of communication. And then the 5th module is more about assessment and diagnostic mental health topics. Yeah. So that's an overview of everything.
Yeah. Thanks, Louise. And I think that overview, just thinking through those topics, even probably gives people watching this an idea of how many different areas that they do need to start to think about, and start to think, what does that look like at this part? What does it look like at this part? And, as a family therapist, I've said to you previously, gosh, I'd often do a genogram as part of getting to know someone and working out, where they come from, where they belong, what's their family history, any family patterns. We would look at things like communication patterns in families and relationship patterns. But I had someone ask me just recently, how do I capture deafness on a genogram? Because Sigrid, I don't know if you know, but there are all these standard symbols that therapists use. And it really raised for me the politics, I would say, of therapy and how people identify themselves, and sometimes how particular standard practices might identify people. Because in the past, I might know that some people might represent that, for example, as a disability. And that's a very different perspective from a cultural perspective. So I think it's really important to consider those issues. And I guess even just hearing about that as a standard practice, and thinking the earlier part of our conversation around how important it is to check with a person how they want to be identified and how they want to be represented, not just in words, but on a genogram, for example. Yeah, I guess I was curious, as you're kind of hearing about some family therapy practices, Sigrid, does anything else kind of come to your mind around, well, if you're looking at families and where people come from and how you capture that information, is there anything you think that's really important for me and for others to hold in mind?
Well, I'm not aware of any standard symbol in the therapy context that matches deaf or hard of hearing. But in a different context, there are a few things that have been used as a symbol. So for deaf events or community events,
Yeah.
when we're promoting that, sometimes we use the symbol of the hands, and they look like this.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when we're talking about access, you can use a different symbol, like the ear with a line through it.
Mm.
And that's a little bit, there's some issues in the community about that, like what Louise was talking about in regards to deafhood being less about the levels of hearing and actually more about the identity and culture. It's not really focused on just this one body part. But for hard of hearing people, or someone who's just recently become deaf, maybe they are more focused on that body part.
Yeah.
So to answer your question about like a one standard way to create a visual symbol for that information, yeah, that is not easy.
No. It's not for a lot of things, even when we think about diversity and gender identity. And I think these days therapists are much more aware of creating symbols together with clients that really fit with the client for their sense of identity. But yeah, gosh, I just keep coming back to this idea of culture for hard of hearing and for deaf people, and the importance of understanding a cultural perspective and how rich and deep that is. And I guess for myself, I feel really inspired to find out more, and I just really appreciate this conversation with you guys.
Yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to ask these in-depth questions.
Yeah,
Sorry.
we're really grateful for the interview today.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited that you've got students who are already working in this area and interested in how to start applying some of your family therapy teachings in the work that they're doing with deaf people and families. That's really exciting that this is starting to take off. Yeah, it's great.
And they're definitely some of my inspiration for this as well.
Mm. Mm.
Now, I could talk to you guys for hours, I think, but we do kind of have to think about how how long we can talk in a video, and because people will be able to access your training modules. So I was thinking maybe if we could draw this conversation to a close for now. Who knows, we might have more conversations. But for now, I wondered if there were any kind of final words from either of you as we wrap up. Sigrid, is there anything that you'd like to kind of say in closing on this video?
Well, I would love to say the best thing is to always be curious. I would really love to contact anyone who would like to learn more, who would like to talk more about this topic, and they can contact us through the website and email me.
Fantastic, thank you. Louise?
I really love that you raised the political aspects of these conversations, because I think there are a lot of political things for us to consider. You know, the deaf people that I've had contact with have been really struggling to identify as a cultural group for a long time. And then with the NDIS, they're being invited into positions that identify disability and barriers. And I think that, you know, that's part of what we're trying to help, you know, clarify for people working in the area and navigating those difficult political terrains. Yeah, so thank you for raising that. Mm.
Thank you. And I should join in with a final reflection, which came to me just as Sigrid was talking. Sigrid, I often say to people that curiosity is a superpower. So I loved hearing you use that word as well. And that would just be my final reflection, is around my curiosity. And I hope this sparks curiosity in so many others. And I guess with that, we would draw this conversation to a close.